Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan, by Michael Kazin, narrated by Malcolm Hillgartner. Publisher's Note: this audiobook may refer to visual elements included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction. The Romance of Jefferson and Jesus. Next to each religion is a political opinion that is joined to it by affinity. Alexis de Tocqueville. I fear the plutocracy of wealth, I respect the aristocracy of learning, but I thank God for the democracy of the heart that makes it possible for every human being to do something to make life worth living while he lives, and the world better for his existence in it. William Jennings Bryan. The day before the election of 1896, 23 married couples from central Pennsylvania sent a letter of tribute to their candidate for president. They gave thanks that divine providence had allowed Bryan, in splendid health and form, to wage a campaign in which he had pilloried plutocracy and revealed to the people the privileged class in all its revolting nakedness. They praised his wife Mary for risking health and life to make the cause of her husband, the people, her cause. Assuming he would win, they looked forward to the redemption of a monopoly-cursed people from the power of mammon. Bryan lost the election, as he did 2 subsequent campaigns for the White House. Yet this letter, one of hundreds of thousands he received that fall, suggests why we should care about him. A man who was elected to no office higher than that of congressman from Nebraska, and who is best known today for prosecuting a young teacher in Tennessee who taught evolution to his students. For many of his correspondents, Bryan was not merely a favorite politician. They believed him to be a godly hero who preached that the duty of a true Christian was to transform a nation and world plagued by the arrogance of wealth and the pain of inequality. That could only mean a radically progressive interpretation of the Gospels, so that, as the Pennsylvanians phrased it, our gaping social wounds may be healed and class distinction leveled. Bryan's creed drove his 3 campaigns for the White House, his work for a dazzling variety of causes both secular and religious, and 30 continuous years of theatrical speech-making throughout the nation and the world. His energetic performances and relentless good cheer made him a wealthy celebrity whose face and voice were as familiar as anyone's in the nation. After his death, a reporter remarked that the press should build a memorial to him, because he was to the world of news what Babe Ruth is to baseball, the real drawing card. Mass appeal lifted Bryan to the top rank of American leaders, despite his failures at the ballot box. Only Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson had a greater impact on politics and political culture during the era of reform that began in the mid-1890s and lasted until the early 1920s. Bryan wooed a following as large as that of either man, and usually more ardent, and the affection was always mutual. The historian Richard Hofstadter wrote that other leading progressives only sensed popular feelings. Bryan embodied them. Remarkably, few loyalists abandoned him after he failed to win the presidency. Some were even glad that, without the responsibilities of state power, the man they called, oxymoronically, the great commoner, would be free to thunder against corporate predators and to champion the unalloyed demands of small farmers and wage earners. In their eyes, Bryan was spiritual kin to the patriarchs and prophets who, according to Hebrews chapter 2, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. His fame and influence depended on his adherence to a worldly faith shared by millions of citizens, one that resisted the compromises endemic to policymaking. That creed married democracy and pietism in a romantic gospel that borrowed equally from Jefferson and Jesus. A leveling faith had dominated the nation's religious life since the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century, which spawned thousands of new Protestant churches and made the passion of evangelicalism the common discourse of most Americans. The idea that anyone, regardless of learning or social background, could come to Christ dovetailed with the belief in equal rights emblazoned in the Declaration of Independence. This synthesis of evangelical Protestantism and republicanism was found in no other nation, at least not with such passionate conviction, nor for such a long period of time. All Democrats honored the author of the Declaration as the founder of their party, but no one in politics could match Bryan's unstinting devotion. Jefferson trusted the people and believed that they were the source of power and authority, he wrote to an admirer. Jefferson's motto of equal rights to all and privileges to none is the fundamental law that governs legislation and the administration of government. Bryan yoked the legitimacy of nearly every major reform for which he campaigned to Jeffersonian principles. In a practical sense, Jefferson was more important to him than Jesus. After all, the Son of God had never uttered an opinion about the protective tariff, the gold standard, or corporate power. But Jefferson was a fierce partisan warrior, and thus left an inexhaustible legacy of opinions and principles for those of a similar ideological persuasion. Bryan gained a reputation as an agrarian rebel, and it is natural to assume that this explains his affinity for Jefferson. The Squire of Monticello had famously intoned that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, and described great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. But Bryan's own speeches and writings contained no such references to his idol's views. Instead, he applauded Jefferson in universal terms. As a militant defender of popular democracy and a scourge of privilege, whether it stemmed from an accident of birth or the favoritism of public and private authorities. Nothing was said about the Virginian's ownership of slaves, or his elaborate apologies for an institution that mocked his egalitarian principles and those of every other 19th-century Democrat. Bryan's favorite gift to other public figures was a hefty reference book, the Jeffersonian Cyclopedia, which served up the great man's opinions in short paragraphs, organized alphabetically by topic. When asked in the 1920s to name 10 books that affected my life and influenced my conduct, Bryan placed only the Bible ahead of it. He never had to choose between them. During the late 19th century, when Bryan was a young man, evangelical rhetoric saturated nearly every mass movement in America. Spokesman for the Knights of Labor, which had over 1 million members in the 1880s, cursed the money power as the Antichrist, that only a new Pentecost could humble. Father Edward Glynn, a charismatic labor priest excommunicated for his vigorous defense of the Knights, portrayed Christ as an evicted peasant who came to preach a gospel of liberty to the slave, of justice to the poor, of paying the full hire to the workman. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, the largest women's group in the nation, claimed that its work to close down saloons, improve prison conditions, shelter prostitutes, and support labor unions for women were all examples of God in politics. The altruistic sisterhood, wrote one member, continually opens its windows toward Jerusalem and prays the government to make it easy for the people to do right and hard for them to do wrong. The 2 million-strong Farmers' Alliance held mass encampments identical in form to the revival meetings common in the South and Great Plains. From Colorado to the Carolinas, rebel lecturers told their audiences, God has promised to hear the cry of the oppressed, and preached that no man in this nation can live a consistent Christian life unless he threw himself into the agrarian insurgency. This was a social gospel from below, and it produced its own breed of prophets. The journalist Henry George predicted that the enactment of his single tax on unimproved land, proposed in his popular 1879 tome, Progress and Poverty, would bring about the culmination of Christianity, the city of God on earth, with its walls of jasper and its gates of pearl. His writings and speeches evangelized a religiously diverse mass of followers, many of whom persevered in their singular mission years after George's death. Edward Bellamy's best-selling 1888 novel, Looking Backward, described a future egalitarian utopia that had come about when Americans of all classes rejected the cutthroat immorality of capitalism and embraced instead a gospel of solidarity. Disciples of Bellamy flocked to new nationalist clubs as if to church, while the author pondered, "What part I am to play in the great deliverance," daily more convinced that it is at hand. All the mass protests of the era called on the language of the Bible because, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, it was the common property of Americans, and thus needed no explanation or apology. Celebrity preachers were just as vital to shaping the world of Bryan and his followers as were such godly insurgencies. During the Gilded Age, crowds of the reverent and the curious flocked to hear both itinerant revivalists and princes of the pulpit, eloquent ministers of the largest urban churches. Both types of preachers built their reputations, as did Bryan later, by defining a moral code through performances that were at once didactic and pleasurable. Henry Ward Beecher, pastor of Brooklyn's Plymouth Church, was a gifted apostle of Christianity as good news. The former abolitionist refused to dwell on original sin, divine punishment, or the need for moral discipline. "I am apt to look at the bright side of things and take a cheerful view of life," he admitted. A man of furious energy, he once told a close friend that he had more health than he knew what to do with. Beecher thought it his mission to install a gospel of love in place of the grim doctrines on which his own congregational, originally Puritan, denomination had been founded. Beecher gave most of his sermons while seated, in the midst of the people, raised above them that all might see him, yet still among them, and one of them, as one admirer put it. Intimacy was also a hallmark of mass revivals, although the leaders of such events were quite eager to preach against sin. Certain evangelists who yearned to rescue Americans from the flesh-pots of modern urban culture were as entertaining and sentimental as any actor on the vaudeville stage. Samuel P. Jones, a Georgia Methodist, traveled around the South during the Gilded Age, wisecracking his case for prohibition and the inerrancy of Scripture. He called his backsliding listeners flop-eared hounds, beer kegs, and whiskey soaks, and dismissed his inability to grasp all the mysteries of the Bible by declaring, "I believe the whale swallowed Jonah. I would have believed it just the same if it said that Jonah had swallowed the whale." Jones, nicknamed the Sledgehammer, candidly admitted that he fashioned his tough, humorous patter to attract crowds. "I give you what you want first," Jones told a reporter, "and I give you what you need second." The leading revivalist of the period was the Sledgehammer's rhetorical opposite. Dwight L. Moody, his 280 pounds wreathed in a full beard and encased in a dark suit, looked like a conservative businessman or politician, a teetotaling, cigar-abstaining Ulysses S. Grant. In a strong, if nasal voice, Moody, a former shoe salesman, linked simple Bible narratives to the spiritual fears of men and women living, many for the first time, in a grasping, wicked metropolis. His rhetoric, like Beecher's, was optimistic and inclusive. "When we search for God," he assured audiences, "we are sure to find him." The evangelist and his music director, the slim, handsome Ira Sankey, led thousands in song. "Go tell it to Jesus, he knoweth thy grief. Go tell it to Jesus, he'll send thee relief." Beecher and Moody had their theological differences, but they fashioned a common style, relaxed, sentimental, open to all, that resembled that of a barnstorming politician. There was a marked decrease in conflicts between the major evangelical denominations during the Gilded Age, and such preachers contributed to and benefited from the new ecumenism. Beecher and Moody could transcend sectarian rivalries by speaking simply as Christians eager to point out the path to a joyful life and eventual salvation to anyone who would listen. What church an individual belonged to seemed of little significance, as long as it was a Protestant one. The tolerant nature of their preaching fit the adoption by many churches of a more accepting view of mass leisure. In antebellum America, Protestant ministers had denounced amusements of all kinds as immoral diversions from a life of productivity and prayer. But by the last decades of the 19th century, pastors from both liberal and conservative congregations called for improving forms of mass entertainment, rather than prohibiting them altogether. YMCAs offered concerts, game rooms, and stereopticon lectures on foreign lands and peoples. Amusements, wrote Washington Gladden, a pioneer of the social gospel, should not be dominated by those with mercenary motives. The intelligence, the conscience, and the benevolence of the community ought to recognize this realm as belonging to them, and ought to enter in and take possession. This new culture of popular religion skirted the grand controversy between faith and science, and had little to say about the Second Coming. While Darwinism led theologians to either shudder at or guardedly welcome what one historian calls the breakup of an intellectual system that had endured from the beginning of European civilization, most Protestants seemed comfortable both with a supernatural faith and with the rigors and pleasures of modern America. They prayed every day and went to the theater on Saturday, agreed that one could not serve both God and mammon, yet consumed at least as lavishly as their incomes allowed, fretted about the afterlife, and fought for their rights in the present. Bathing their faith in sentimental hues, ordinary Americans ignored what appeared to seminarians and philosophers as glaring contradictions. William James once tried to explain the motivations of religious Americans to an audience of university-trained skeptics. As a rule, we disbelieve all facts and theories for which we have no use. Outside the lecture hall, few Christians doubted the utility of their own convictions. From such sources grew a romantic gospel for the common American, which Bryan would echo repeatedly throughout his career. He and millions of his fellow citizens embraced a democratic bargain, whether they preferred the deathless phrases of Jefferson and his disciples, the messianic rage of labor and farmer activists, the ministerial salvation of a troubled mass public, or a combination of all three. The injunction, vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, worked equally well in both directions. I wrote this book in part to gain a measure of respect for Bryan and his people. I would like to help rescue them from what E.P. Thompson, the great historian and activist, called the enormous condescension of posterity. Bryan was the first leader of a major party to argue for permanently expanding the power of the federal government to serve the welfare of ordinary Americans from the working and middle classes. With the backing of his followers, he preached that the national state should counter the overweening power of banks and industrial corporations by legalizing strikes, subsidizing farmers, taxing the rich, banning private campaign spending, and outlawing the liquor trust. He did more than any other man, between the fall of Grover Cleveland and the election of Woodrow Wilson, to transform his party from a bulwark of laissez-faire into the citadel of liberalism we identify with Franklin D. Roosevelt and his ideological descendants. His one great flaw was to support, with a studied lack of reflection, the abusive system of Jim Crow, a view that was shared until the late 1930s by nearly every white Democrat. Herbert Hoover once snapped that the New Deal was Bryanism under new words and methods, which proves that bitterness need not impair one's historical judgment. But after Bryan's death in 1925, Most intellectuals and activists on the broad left rejected the amalgam that had inspired him. A strict populist morality based on a close reading of Scripture. The only barriers to a just society, he believed, were man-made. God was always on the side of common men and women. Liberals and radicals from the age of FDR to the present have tended to scorn that credo as naive and bigoted, a remnant of an era of white Protestant supremacy that has, or should have, passed. One result is that the notion of Bryan as a creative forerunner will be quite different from a portrait familiar to most contemporary readers. Below that hazy image runs a caption that reads, "Old-fashioned." Bryan is easy to portray as a tribune of lost causes. Since the Civil War, no other major party nominee has been defeated 3 times for the presidency. Bryan railed against financiers, saloon keepers, and evolutionists, all of whom have prospered quite nicely despite his best efforts. For decades after his death, influential scholars and journalists depicted him as a self-righteous simpleton who longed to preserve an age that had already passed. It is probably true that in the modern climate of opinion, no man who can genuinely understand Bryan will be capable of writing his biography, wrote a respected historian at the end of the 1950s. Indeed, anyone who probes into his personal life meets with frustration. Bryan probably received over 1 million pieces of correspondence during his career, but only 2 or 3% of that vast outpouring has been preserved. Few letters between Bryan and his wife Mary survive, and almost none between him and his 3 children or his parents still exist. He was also a poor autobiographer. Thus, speculations about his intimate life must take the place of a detailed interpretation. Fortunately, Bryan was a man who lived most of his adult life in public and away from home. Although his marriage was both cooperative and loving, he seemed happiest when on the road, performing for thousands of strangers. Bryan's public life was virtually his entire life, writes an earlier biographer. The people were his family, the platform his study, crusading his relaxation. From all evidence, Bryan acted in private much as he did in public, with kindness and optimism, yet stiff-necked toward anyone who violated his sense of ethics or belittled his ideas. The private Bryan we can learn about was a rather simple man. He showed little interest in literature, art, or philosophy, and borrowed many of his political ideas and proposals from others. Like a veteran Shakespearean actor, he gladly delivered many of the same speeches year after year to a variety of audiences. But Bryan was also a clever political strategist who retained a formidable degree of influence long after he stopped running for office. Thus, his career was not a simple story, and the effect he had on Americans during his era was quite profound. Like Eugene V. Debs then, and Martin Luther King Jr. later, he had the ability to articulate widely held grievances in original phrases that delighted his listeners and persuaded many to join or support movements from the bottom up that altered American society. As a secular liberal, I confess to a certain ambivalence about both Bryan and his many admirers, who swore that a supernatural force was guiding him. When asked, "Do you like him?" I have no short or easy answer to give. But empathy is essential to the writing of good history, and I have tried to avoid judging either Bryan or his loyalists and enemies by the standards of the present, whose own blinders sit quite firmly in place. A hero, as understood by the ancient Greeks, is not a man whose life is free of errors and contradictions. He is instead, as the classicist Moses Haddis has written, a man whose career has somehow enlarged the horizons of what is possible for humanity, and who has therefore, after his death, been deemed worthy of religious commemoration. A man without flaws, adds Haddis, is not apt to possess the determined energy heroism requires. William Jennings Bryan became a hero to people who believe that politics should be a moral enterprise, and that religion should purify the political world. In many ways he does belong to an age we have lost, when few Americans could vote if they weren't male and white, when farmers were a pivotal interest group, and when traveling lecturers and other performers offered thrilling diversion to millions of people who otherwise might have gone without. Yet in some ways Bryan's time is not unlike our own. Large corporations still dominate our economy, bankroll our politicians, and frame our mass culture. Pious, if often intemperate voices still denounce the corrosive impact of modern society and look to a spiritual awakening to cleanse the body politic. But we lack politicians filled with conviction and blessed with charisma who are willing to lead a charge against secular forces whose power is both mightier and more subtly deployed than a century ago. Perhaps the story of an earnest and eloquent, if not godly, hero can help. Chapter 1. Education of a Hero, 1860 to 1890. He borrows from the philosopher his principles, from the poet his language, from the warrior his courage, and mingling with these his own enthusiasms, leads his hearers according to his will. William Jennings Bryan on Oratory, 1877. Salem may never be more than a pleasant stop along the interstate highway that slices through the verdant prairie of south-central Illinois. Stretched out beyond the sign listing a population of 8,000 is the usual array of chain hotels and restaurants, gaudy gas stations and car washes, and tiny convenience stores. An imposing Caterpillar rental and repair place suggests that the local economy is thriving, while 26 local churches compete to fill a set of loftier needs. Yet one can stroll down the main street of Salem in the middle of a weekday in summer without encountering more than a handful of residents. The nearest movie theater is down in Centralia, 16 miles away. A different fate seemed possible in the 1850s when Silas Bryan moved to town. The Ohio and Mississippi Railroad had just run tracks down Main Street, which made it possible to reach St. Louis in only 90 minutes, the same time it takes to drive the distance today. A Methodist women's college with 2 faculty members had recently opened its doors, and freshly built churches dotted the dirt streets of the newly incorporated town, the seat of Marion County. A few miles outside town there lay ample deposits of bituminous coal, and 3 flour mills were unable to keep up with the demand of a growing population. Salem is rapidly improving, boasted the local weekly in 1854, and its elements of wealth and prosperity are now being rapidly developed. Soon it would be a commanding point where industry, sobriety, and honesty will surely thrive, where good health may be found, where long life may be enjoyed, and where all the concomitants of competence and opulence are inevitable. Silas Bryan's own ambitions dovetailed with those of his town. He was born in 1822, the 8th child of a farm family from Point Pleasant, a village that then lay inside Virginia's western border with Ohio. At the age of 18 he left a crowded log cabin to move westward in search of an education and, perhaps, a fortune. Harvesting crops and chopping wood, he slowly amassed enough credits to graduate at the age of 27 from McKendree College, a Methodist institution in southern Illinois. He then followed a career path common to educated men in rural America during the middle of the 19th century. A few years of teaching school followed by reading law books and passing a bar examination. In 1851, Silas moved to Salem and opened a legal practice. A year later, he married Maria Jennings, a reverent, resourceful, lovely young woman who was one of his former pupils. They built a small 2-story frame house on Broadway Street, a 5-minute walk from the county courthouse, which still marks the epicenter of Salem. Silas matured into a man of substance and an indispensable father of his town. He was a pioneering member of the provincial legal elite that did much to establish genteel society in the hinterland of mid-century America. Townspeople admired his legal skills and compensated him well, so well that in 1866 he was able to buy a 520-acre farm a mile outside of town with a deer park alongside it. Area voters, most of whom were Democrats, also elected him to a series of public offices. Over a 20-year span, Silas served in the state Senate, as a circuit court judge, and as a leading member of the committee that drafted a new Illinois Constitution.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?